All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to episode 9 of the Unclassified podcast. I'm Preston Stewart, joined by Ben Wheeler. Ben, how you doing this January 10th?
I'm doing well. It's snowing here, which is par for the course, but it's just never fun when it snows.
I hate
When
it
you're
so
a
much.
kid, it's fun,
I don't know.
but
We
when
we
you're an
moved
adult, no.
we moved from I grew up in the Midwest, Illinois. Wife was from Michigan. We lived in Michigan after I got out of the army. Lived in Michigan, lived in Chicago, and then had enough. Moved down to Texas, and now we're in Tennessee. I just like, but we're getting it. We're getting the snow, and it just shuts down the entire city. They shut down schools like across the
Oof.
state, I think. But
That's brutal. You have to teach people how to drive and maybe how to shovel. I don't know.
no, we just lock it down. Lock it down. Stay home. Wait for some football to come on later tonight. Look, we got a full show, and we've got our first guest
Yeah.
coming on today.
hmm
Later in the episode today, we're going to be talking to Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, who I butcher his name every time, and I feel so bad about it. But Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. I've put out some of his information before in YouTube videos, TikTok videos, on Twitter. He's doing a really good job over there. And we're going to talk to him primarily about issues in the Middle East. So we're going to shift to that in the second half of the episode. But to start out, we're going to end up like more domestic focused, I guess, is the way to put it. It's
I mean,
is that
it? Is it
it's
domestic
more domestic
focused?
than normal.
That is true. So you want me to kick us off here?
Well, no, I want to start out with a show and tell just to lighten the
All
mood
right.
before we get
Yes.
into
So
U.S.
what do you
invasion
have
plans.
here?
Yeah, so I was in Austin
Yeah.
last week, uh,
hmm
seeing my family, and we were going through some of my grandparents' old stuff, and we found this right here. This is a World
What is
War
it?
One cover. It's a World War One cover hat that my
Oh,
great grandfather wore, and you'll see.
that's
So
pretty
this
cool.
is, yeah. So this is his. It's a VFW medal, so that's not like an official military medal, but he was a member of the VFW. Right here, excuse me, crossed cannons. He was a field artilleryman.
Really?
So
Do you know
yeah,
what
cannoneer,
division, what unit?
124th, I believe.
My great
124th
grandfather was in the
Artillery. Yeah,
82nd Airborne.
really. World War Two.
He was. World War II.
That's cool.
Julius Caesar Wheeler was his name. No joke.
Ooh,
So, quite the name, right? But Julius Caesar and your great grandfather would not be pleased to find out that we are invading Greenland again. A headline that they would be startled to see twice in their life. So the president-elect, Donald John Trump, has said that he will not rule out military force or economic coercion when it comes to obtaining Greenland and Panama. This set the world ablaze because everyone kind of thought it was just another one of these weird fixations and he would get over it and it would just be whatever. But that was not the case this time around. Donald Trump is now not ruling out any kind of force. And he seems full steam ahead to do it. Now, his supporters say, well, he's just trying to get negotiation tactics. Others have said, when you're the president of the United States, you can't threaten your allies like this. Greenland is a property of Denmark, who's a NATO member. They're in the EU. So this is quite the event. And so global backlash has been sparked. France pledged to stop any kind of military action from happening. Germany, condemned it very forcefully. And then kind of said they don't really understand what his problem is. Russia rooted them on. They had their state propaganda had I guess, you got to give it to them. They called it the Donroe Doctrine. So props to that. And but the EU had an interesting press conference where they said that the mutual assistance clause, if the United States were to take military action against Greenland and Denmark, would activate the mutual assistance clause, which doesn't put the entire continent at war with the United States, but more or less it does, right? It creates that framework in the same way NATO does. And Trump also said that perhaps he'll place heavy tariffs on Denmark if they don't give up Greenland. And Denmark here is kind of like, what's the deal, dude? Because the current treaty we have with Greenland/Denmark gives U.S. the right to do whatever it wants on the island. So that's kind of an issue. And Panama, for the most part, I don't know, they've protested it. Colombia's, on board with their protests along with the rest of Latin America, but nothing as forceful as France's, we're not going to let the United States attack the EU. So before we get into Canada, shall we just talk about Greenland and Panama?
Yeah, I saw a really good take. So I'm going to walk it back from the brink here.
Yes.
And I saw a really good take from General McMaster's just yesterday. I think it was on something. The background was the Council on Foreign Relations. So I don't know if it was an event there or something they hosted, but nonetheless, he was asked about all this. And I thought he put it really well, where he said, look, Trump thinks out loud. And that's very different than the majority of people in government, certainly different than the majority of our presidents. And he said sometimes that gets him in trouble, to where it takes options off the table or forces his hand in certain directions. So it's not necessarily a good thing, but it's the thing. And that's what he does and that's what that press conference reminded me of, where he was just kind of, it sounded like he was thinking out loud as he was answering those questions. So I would step back a little bit, and part of what McMaster's hit on was saying there's always something more to it. It's rare that it's just completely thrown out of the blue. There's a further objective, and it's just a matter of figuring out, like, what is that objective? Even if all of the things lining up in front of it are a little bit off the rocker, like going to war with some of our close allies, clearly is not an enviable position. Like, nobody wants to do that.
No.
Americans don't want to do that. Be hard pressed to find very many Americans that want to go to war over Greenland. So clearly, that's not the actual thing. What is it? And that gets into the possibility of the Arctic. Maybe we haven't prioritized our abilities to affect control in that area of the world as much as like Russia and maybe even China have, to a degree. If you look at the Arctic, China and Greenland clearly have much more access to that part of the world than we do right now. Maybe there's something there. My big takeaway, just in terms of location. I mean, I don't know that they have more military assets per se.
But what access does China have to the Arctic?
Access?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't. Maybe I misspoke there. I know Russia's been heavily focused on the Arctic. So let's keep it at there rather than my muddying the waters with China here. But nonetheless, there has been a lot of talk about the strategic significance of the Arctic, and Canada and Greenland have that access that would be nice to have. I'm a little torn on if they're allies. That seems like a good thing. That's generally how we've operated. And I guess my big takeaway with all of this is, because you'll hear people making their arguments as to why this is the right thing or the preferred thing for U.S. national security. I would say, even if you start following those arguments start to finish, is it a priority? And that's where I'm kind of stuck. I'm not sure that pushing our allies and threatening our allies over national security issues in the Arctic right now should be the top priority, which it kind of feels like it is all of a sudden.
I agree. I also think it's like, with both Canada and Greenland, we, all due respect to Canada, they have given us some of their sovereignty with NORAD, with some of the agreements we have in the Arctic. And, with the Greenland Treaty, we're allowed to do whatever we want. I fully agree with you that it's just we already can do whatever we want, but we don't have to pay for managing Greenland. We don't have to pay for managing Canada. It's just easier that way, right? And I'm not calling them puppets, but through our defense relationship, we already allowed to have like laissez-faire, So, pushing us this far, this close into it is quite a mess. But from there, Trump also said that he would force Canada to become the 51st state via economic pressure. The 51st state thing's interesting to me because they're just, the whole country is going to be a state. They're not breaking up into provinces. But also it's like, does Trump know the Quebecois exist? Because I know we have some Quebecois listeners, but to an American, the whole situation's a bit strange. And so I just can't imagine Alberta and Quebec being in one state together. But anyways, so Trudeau gets on the mic and he says there's a snowball's chance in hell Canada will ever join the United States. And he says that he thinks Trump is doing this to distract and that Canada's identity is that they aren't American, so this will never work. And then other Canadian politicians kind of got into the fold. You had Doug Ford, who's the Ontario premier. You might remember him from, Rob Ford? I don't know if anyone remembers Rob Ford. He was the mayor of Toronto who got
Yeah, that's
suspended
what I was
for
thinking
smoking crack. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I'll get you.
He has since passed away, but his brother, Doug Ford, is the Ontario premier, and he said that Canada should buy Alaska and Minnesota. Then Elizabeth May, who is the leader of the Green Party, they only hold 2 seats, so they're not that significant, but regardless, she said California and Oregon and Washington should secede for free healthcare. So things are going very good. Also, he said he's going to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. There's unclear why exactly, but that is what's happening there. I've seen some people in the media say that, I've seen Trudeau say it's a distraction. I don't think Trump's trying to distract from anything. I think Trump is distracted. And it's clear that I think that a lot of this talk is perhaps about him not wanting to have to deal with, right now, the House and the Senate are debating these big spending cuts, tax cuts, Social Security cuts, in addition to a whole plethora of options there. And he just doesn't seem to want to deal with it. They keep asking him, do you prefer one bill or 2 bills? And he's like, I just trust they'll come up with a good idea. And I was like, okay, so he just does not care, which, props to him. But I think he wants easily digestible wins, which is what you see of like Space Force, which is the idea of like Mexico's going to build the wall. I think Trump has a brilliant insight into the American mind to that extent, where it's like, if he gets Greenland somehow, then that is such a big accomplishment to your average American. Whereas like Joe Biden's infrastructure law or the CHIPS Act, I mean, these are crazy innovations for the United States, but ask your average person how they understand. They don't know. What's the CHIPS Act do? They don't know, So I think Trump has this kind of brilliant insight where he wants these easy wins. He knows if he gets control of the Panama Canal, if he gets control of Greenland, that's big for him. I mean, even admitting Canada as a state, that puts him down in the history books forever. Although I would argue he's already there. He is already there. So,
I mean, you can, whether you like him or dislike him, it's hard to argue that the skill that's there. If it's hard to imagine anybody saying the last few things that he said, and anybody can say something, but he got a large portion of the population on board to all of a sudden start defending why Canada should be a state and why military action should be considered for Greenland. It's impressive that he's able to do that. I will say on some Russian Telegram channels, interestingly, they were viewing this as Trump got all of his briefings about the war in Ukraine and decided that's not going to be an easy resolution, which I think most of us have been saying. So instead, he's going for the easy win of Canada, Panama, and Greenland. I thought that's, I agree with the first part. I don't know that adding a bunch of territory to the United States from our allies would be considered easy by any stretch of the imagination, but nonetheless, that's kind of the one of the Russian takes at this point, and they love it for what it's worth.
Oh, absolutely.
They love this right now.
I saw a Russian TV host say that it legitimizes their claims to Ukraine and the Baltics and the rest of the Soviet Empire because just like, well, the United States can do it, why can't Russia? And I think the thinking is sound there. I don't agree with that because I don't think the United States should be able to do it anyways. But the thinking sound there. And I have seen a lot of Trump's backers kind of fall back on the logic that, well, the United States and Canada merging together would be both for good countries. I do think that's true. They also say the same about Greenland. Greenland joining would be good for both countries. I do agree with that. But I think there's something like deeply evil to consider forcing them to do it. As Americans, we believe in the right to self-determination, so you can't force them to do it. If Canada wants to join, have a referendum to join, I welcome them in open arms. Same with Greenland, Panama, Mexico, any other country who's threatened. If they want to join, I support it if they're voting in good conscience. But I just don't think, just because it's good for both nations, I mean, the other party has to agree. We just can't say might makes right. So that's my take on it. I think it benefits both nations, but if they're not down for it, what are we doing? But this is resulting in huge soft power loss for the United States. because now the EU is trying to figure out how to deal with Trump. And I mean, you speak to people at NATO, I've spoken to some people at NATO, spoken to some European officials, and they'll tell you that they don't think he's serious, that everything that comes out of his mouth is bullshit, yada, yada, yada. We'll see. But they're making quite the bet here. And the reporters are getting kind of fed up with them. You saw your reporter shouting at the EU in their commission just a few days ago saying, so you're not going to give a comment? You know, the President of the United States has given a pretty naked threat here, and you're not going to comment? And then he said, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for American Marines to arrive in Greenland? And I was like, oof. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I get frustrated with some of this. I get frustrated with some of this because it's like you force the comment, and you have to say something, and like, I don't know, maybe we just wait and see where this goes, because it doesn't, you know, I don't think we're landing or boarding up landing craft off the East Coast right now. Like, just talk it through. My big overall thing here is priorities. Like, I just don't know that this is, even if you agree with this full force and can argue that it's all positive, I don't know that it's the top priority right now. But before we move on, the Electoral College piece here, California, I had to do all this searching while you're talking. Canada's population is 40 million. That would mean that if they were one state, they would have as many electoral votes as California or more. And I think generally Canada probably skews more left than right in terms of American politics. So that seems like it's probably not in the cards, right? Like, I can't imagine a Republican president and a Republican Congress would say, you know what we should do? Bring in another state that will skew the Electoral College in favor of the other party for the foreseeable future. That seems like not a thing they would do.
My understanding is that their ideas are that if Canada's not going to, I mean, this is just what I've gathered from the Trump influencer fear, is that they are, you know, Canada should become part of the United States, but whether or not they're given full citizenship, full statehood, is left for debate, because they, quote, have to make the numbers work for them. So, I don't know.
Are those the numbers, the Electoral College thing?
Yeah, although it seems like they're going to get Trump to agree to get rid of the popular vote. We'll see if the Republican House and Senate go along with that, but that seems to be the Democrats' goal, and Trump seems to be fully on board with it. So,
all right, let's shift out of the hypothetical realm. Yeah, shift out of hypothetical here, go down to New Orleans. A little bit more information on this terrorist attack down there. The guy who carried it out, it does look now to be confirmed that he operated by himself. So there were no other individuals on the ground with him. And as more information, so this was a truck ramming attack. He rented a truck, drove it through crowds in New Orleans, got out of the truck and opened fire, and was subsequently killed by New Orleans law enforcement, who I feel like should probably get a lot more praise. I don't know if you saw the video of the minute the call came in, these guys dropped everything and sprinted down the street. Love that.
I did see that.
Hate that they have to be in that situation, but good on those guys, and gals. And they catch so much flack. I just want to say that. Like, with these fires going in California, first responders, we have this thing where, like, we love them, but also they catch so much flack every time they do anything, even 1% less than people think they should. And I hate it, because it probably makes people look at that and say, well, I don't want to do that. They're not idiots. They have social media. They see what people are saying about them. It's probably making fewer people want to do these jobs that are critical to saving lives and keeping good order. So let's celebrate when they do good stuff. But nonetheless, rant aside, Islamic State did finally kind of claim responsibility for this. If you remember, the driver of that truck claimed bay'ah, or allegiance, pledged his allegiance to the Islamic State shortly before the attack. And Islamic State just kind of sat on it, which is a little out of the ordinary. And just a couple days ago, they ended up putting out in their weekly newspaper. So they didn't even publish like a one-off press statement, which they historically will do. Like the bombings in Iran, the attack in Moscow. They don't wait for their weekly newspaper to come out. They announce that right away. They're like, guess what, guys? We did that. This time they waited until their weekly newspaper came out called Al-Naba. And in that, they never say his name. They never say the attacker's name. They never list him as a martyr, which is kind of an honorific title in this sense. And this is all coming from Mina Alami on X, a great resource in this realm. And she said instead they refer to him as an American man influenced by Islamic State messaging, a man in his 40s, and simply the man. So this guy offers this layup to Islamic State, and Islamic State is like, I mean, cool, but we're not really going to claim this fully, at least.
I mean, the delay was probably because they had to go through the chain of command, 1,000 slots below to figure out who the actual press secretary is. Given
a lot
how
of
much
people
they were
dying.
wiped
Yeah.
out. Yeah. That is interesting that they don't. I feel like you're right. If I were a terror leader of a group that's pretty irrelevant now, I would be just claiming. If someone said, "Yeah, I did it because I'm in ISIS," I'd say, "Yeah, that's us." Because why not? I mean, what else do you have to?
That's the
I don't know why they
interesting
didn't
thing
claim
here.
credit. Yeah.
This type of inspired attack. So it's not. We've seen some that are directed, right? It's Islamic State. They've got these facilitators online, and they'll kind of groom people into helping them select targets. That's what we call more or Islamic State directed. That's still a thing. But the more dangerous one, and what Islamic State has been pushing for years now, are these inspired attacks. Hey, check out our propaganda, check out our messaging. Maybe it will resonate with a few people, and we'll just sprinkle in some ideas on what you can do, and maybe some targets and some tactics and techniques, and hopefully a couple people pick it up and carry it out. And we've seen that around the world. This, unfortunately, what happened in New Orleans is relatively new-ish in the United States. I think Brooklyn back in 2017, there was something similar. A guy associated with Islamic State in the same degree drove a car through some streets, killing some people, or I think he rented a U-Haul or something. In Europe, this is a little more common. So it's not out of the ordinary at all, but it's interesting that Islamic State is pushing this type of attack, but then not jumping on to claim every one of them. I asked Mina in that thread why, and she said it might have been because the guy had clear mental health issues, marital problems, talked about killing his own family, might have to do with his being an American service member. So it kind of gives
Could
this
be bad
idea
for the
that
brand.
yeah, there's almost like a line for Islamic State, which does kind of push back against, you'll see this online. People will say, well, Islamic State will claim anything, whether or not they did it. And that really hasn't been the case. By and large, they tend to wait. And when they do claim responsibility, there's some evidence to support it. We haven't seen very many cases where like an IED goes off and it's a random lone wolf actor. Islamic State says it was us, and then after the fact, we find out that it wasn't. So they are kind of picky with who they choose to die on their behalf.
Why do you think that? Why? I mean, a lot of these guys who are in these terror groups are, sinners even by their own definitions. I mean, Bin Laden, he's not the leader of ISIS, obviously, but was not following these Muslim rules or his extremist Muslim rules. Same with al-Baghdadi. So, like, do you think it actually matters? Do you think they actually care? Do you think it's like they're just fading away?
We need to get somebody on to talk about that. I got a couple people in mind that would be good to dive into it, but it's very complex. If you go back to the war in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq group led by Zarqawi was a criminal, like through and through. And his path to jihad was like opportunistic in a lot of ways, and he really wasn't all that pious. We've seen other leaders, especially with the rise of Islamic State, that have over time kind of made that turn and fully converted, maybe is the way to put it. There's got to be a way to put this, where they've gone fundamentalist, they've gone extremist, and they have really kind of shunned a lot of the things that you would consider against their religion in certain aspects. As you get down the ranks, you start to see more variance from that. But that might be part of the thing here, trying to stay on brand, right? But it's interesting because, by and large, Islamic State has lost all their territory. They have very small pockets still in Syria. This is how they exert control now, are these dispersed attacks around the world. And I like the message that it sends to other people thinking about doing this of, wait a minute, Islamic State might not even claim me if I say I did it on their behalf. Great. Hopefully that puts a little, hiccup in somebody's plans and thoughts to try to do this and gain notoriety, if you will.
That is an interesting take. I guess perhaps you're right. What else do we have here? We have. Are we still? Do we still have the Islamic State, or are we going? You want to go to Ukraine?
Let's go to Ukraine real quick. There's a couple different issues there. Have you been following this Kursk kind of offensive operation over
No.
the last week or so? It's interesting. On last Sunday, so Kursk is the area inside of Russia where Ukraine kicked off back in August an offensive. And offensive is the right term. They took the lines were relatively static, had been from the start of the war. They pushed multiple brigades into Russia, occupied that territory, dug in, and held the lines. And they're still there. And this is the area where Russia has started to use some North Korean troops. And we've seen videos and documentation of North Korean troops being killed in that fight. On Sunday, they attacked again. And there was about 6 hours worth of doom posting on Russian Telegram, which is always hilarious because they just go off the deep end so quickly. And there was about 6 to 12 hours worth of kind of optimistic posting on key Ukrainian accounts, and then it just stopped. So it looks more and more like this was just a localized type counterattack, maybe stabilize the lines in certain areas. But nonetheless, it does kind of hint that that operation there in Kursk is far from over. Ukraine has probably lost about 50% of the territory that they once occupied, but Russia's having a real hard time actually pushing Ukraine out of Russia.
I mean, did you see that Chris Cappy documentary or video when he went into Kursk?
Mm-hmm.
That is the most surreal thing I've ever seen before in my life. And all these Russians just seem to be like, whatever. Is that just how it is in a war zone? People are just like, whatever? It was bizarre to me.
No, I mean, it's very unit dependent, very soldier specific, very conditions dependent. I would expect to see that kind of whatever mentality along certain portions of the front, especially, northern Ukraine, let's say. Those guys aren't facing any real threat on either side of the border, but they have to be there. There's probably some monotony to that. In Kursk, we've seen it a little bit different, where it actually spiked Russian enlistments in the region, understandably so. A foreign military moved into your land, and they saw their own buildings and roads being destroyed. Ukraine captured a lot. Captured's the wrong word. They had a lot of Russian civilians that they had detained because they moved in. They took this territory, and the civilians, a lot of them, were like, we're just going to hunker down and wait this out. And by the time they waited it out, they were 3 miles behind the front lines. So yeah. Ukraine moved them back into Ukraine, and then over the course of the next few weeks facilitated transfers for swaps. So Ukrainian POWs for Russian civilians. And in some cases, I think actually that's not correct. The POW swaps, from my understanding, have always been soldier to soldier. I think there were a couple instances here where they just, in full, were like, here's a bunch of Russian civilians back, facilitated through Red Cross. But in that case, you are seeing some more motivated Russian fighters because they're defending their own territory. And it's been a call to arms across Russia. So I don't know that, in fact, along the entire front, I would argue that some of the more motivated Russian soldiers we're seeing are in Kursk right now.
Interesting. So the 155th Brigade, tell me about it.
Yeah, this isn't good. So the 155th Brigade was one of these new attempts. It's in Ukraine. It's the Mechanized Brigade. It was a new-ish attempt, where they decided we're going to build out a brigade, start to finish, outfitted entirely with Western equipment. And it's not as, you've got a wide mix of people. You've got some people that are already in the military, some that are newly joined up, different ranges of training. So they're creating this organization from scratch. They had some leaders in Ukraine, but the big story here is they faced massive desertion and significant under-equipping when they headed out to the front. So they had the exact numbers. Let me see, I've got the article pulled up here. They were supposed to have more than 5,800 troops. 1,700 of those went AWOL, absent without leave, during the course of their training. So I don't know, it was like a third of the troops just gone. That is insanely high. And we haven't really seen that in any unit throughout this, any war, any conflict. 30% going AWOL is shocking. But that's not really been a theme. And this unit's actually under criminal investigation now in Ukraine. And they're looking at what the hell happened here. because they had troops going AWOL in France, which was the first indicator of like, wait a minute, if we're sending people abroad and then they disappear, that's not a good thing. But they also had them going AWOL in Western Ukraine and in Poland, and they had where the unit was kind of mixed. Some were in training, some were at the front. Guys at the front were going AWOL. So it looks like they're narrowing it down to pretty significant leadership failure. And on top of that, they sent these guys to the front, supposedly, according to this investigation, without drones, without FPV drones, which is unfathomable at this point in the war. And a lot of their new vehicles, to include Leopard tanks, didn't have any of the added protection. So the drone protection, the screens overhead, things like that, or electronic warfare. So they saw some of these brand new Leopard tanks knocked out day one, the first time they were ever used in an operation. So elements of the unit are still fighting in and around Pokrovsk, but right now there's a criminal investigation going on to find out what happened here. Who is responsible? Where is the failure point? And there's probably going to be a couple aspects of this that kind of fall apart. I have a feeling that trying to field an entirely new brigade is going to come up as an issue rather than backfilling some of the units at the front. And then rushing equipment into combat before it's ready is really not something we've seen from Ukraine. They've done a pretty good job of waiting until those things are ready to go, or at least up to standard to enter the fight. That feels like a personal decision somewhere down the chain of command, and I have a feeling that's going to be called out, and we'll see. But pretty messy.
Very messy. That's why did they not go fully equipped? Just they didn't have the stuff, or
they're saying they didn't have the stuff. And it's, again, the investigation's ongoing. Some were saying that the Ministry of Defense wouldn't allocate it, which that's a thing. Like in any military, if you there's times where they just say you're not authorized that, or we don't have enough of those, or you didn't request it the right way, like stupid bureaucracy. That could have been it, or it could have been failure down at the unit level. If they didn't request it, then they're not going to get it, kind of thing. So we'll see. But this is something that caught traction across a lot of platforms. It started on some kind of very local, small Ukrainian channels, and fortunately picked up steam because it's a big issue, especially for us Western partners helping to support this military. We want to know, like, is there a problem? Like, how can we fix this, and how can we do better next time?
Interesting. Speaking of Russians and people dying and not good stuff, the Russians, they had a bounty program apparently on American soldiers in Afghanistan. What do we know, Preston?
Do you remember this story from a couple of years ago?
I do. And now tell me, just to give a recap to viewers, the story came out that Russians had placed bounties on American soldiers. It was leaked from the CIA. This was during the Trump-CIA battle where, when it all starts, the CIA gets the Saudis on audio and videotape cutting up, what's his name? Khashoggi. And they're like, we're with 100% confidence Mohammed Bonesaw did this, and he's like, no, I don't think the CIA is right, blah, blah, blah. So that starts the fight there. And then he does something with Putin, and he downplays this, and he says he doesn't believe it. And it was like a whole big ordeal. But now we have more information on it. So
yeah, it's an interesting one because I remember at the time it was like discredited, written off as not. That was my memory of it. When people would say the Russians had bounties on American soldiers, I had in my mind, was that ever proven, or was it just a one-off statement? So what happened here in the last couple of days is the Insider came out with a new investigation where they were actually able to name the Russians involved in running this program and the individuals in Afghanistan that were running the funds. So what they found, and the title of this Insider article or investigation is $200,000 for every American killed, how the GRU paid the Taliban for terrorist attacks. Now, GRU, Russian military intelligence, and they list out a couple different guys here, one of whom runs Unit 29155, make sure I get that one right, which, to go back to Chris Cappy, Task and Purpose, they did a great job talking about that organization. It's their foreign assassination group, if you will. Yeah, 29155. They're the ones behind poisonings in Europe and things like that. And they listed a couple of these Russian officers, and what they found after talking with some Afghans from the National Directorate of Security, so NDS, kind of their CIA, domestic-ish, CIA, FBI mix in Afghanistan. They said, yeah, this was well known for a long time. We all knew it. And we passed this information to the United States, and nothing happened. And before we take this partisan, it does look like the information came out under the Trump administration, and they said not enough information there. But then when Biden got into office, same thing. They said, yeah, we got it, but there's not enough information there to validate it. And this insider report is pushing back, saying it was there. This information was known, to include some CIA officers at the time saying, the only thing we didn't know were the exact names of these people, but that should have been enough evidence to push this forward. Essentially what happened is the GRU had a relationship through Iran with the Taliban. By 2015, the United States and our allies weren't any closer to leaving the country. So they were trying to find ways to kind of ramp that up. And they said they started offering bounties to the Taliban because they wanted the Taliban to focus more on killing Americans and killing our allies in the country rather than killing their political adversaries in Afghanistan. So $200,000 per. This investigation was able to track the head of this organization in Afghanistan, Rahmatullah Azizi. The guy, there's a whole front company that happens to be set up on a road just a short walk from GRU headquarters, on the street where a bunch of Russian spies receive their state-issued apartments. The guy's dad sets up a company in Afghanistan the same day or the same time period. It's a gem trading company. Oh, and he sets it up under a fake name, under a fake passport that is numerically in line with other GRU operatives that have been discovered in the past. Classic. So fake passport in this GRU series. They raid his house in Afghanistan. The Afghans do find $650,000 cash. It's a front company. This gem trading company is just a front. And that's kind of where it sits. So, yeah.
So you say that they did this to try to drive the Americans out. Is that right? Or they did it to keep the Americans in? How does where's the logic that this pushes the Americans out rather than keeps them in? Yeah.
Yeah. So I should say that there's a gap in this story right now of the Taliban receiving the funds in exchange for services, if you will, right? There's no written contract or anything like that. There's a lot of evidence linking the GRU to members of the Taliban before and after the fall. But when we talk about the incentive for Russia doing this, we do have to extrapolate a little bit because they're not going to – this is a secretive Russian military intelligence organization. So we're not going to find their mission statement clearly written out. The general belief is that they wanted the United States to exit Afghanistan because they didn't want the United States to have a strong ally right close to the Russian borders, kind of in their southern doorstep. And anytime the United States fails, it's a good thing for Russia. So I would kind of liken this to a lot of the Cold War battles where it's just a matter of watching the other group fail. And look, they still mock us and make fun of us for the Afghan withdrawal. Like that's kind of, they love that. So I don't know. My guess is it probably was more focused on trying to get us to leave than actually staying and bleeding us out.
Well, they're probably mocking us because, I mean, after the number the Mujahideen did on them in Afghanistan, their dads aren't around, and now they're being sent to die in Ukraine. So I can imagine, maybe a tough spot there. But interesting. So it seems like, did the Taliban take the money and then not kill any American? Because, of course, there was the Taliban Ring of Protection that existed in 2019, 2020, where the Trump administration or the CIA, I don't know, told them, protect American forces and we'll get out. And they said, all right. And there was an American combat death. I don't want to fudge numbers, but I believe in a year, maybe over a year. And they protected them from ISIS. And then the United States started acting as the Taliban's air force at one point, where the Taliban would be fighting ISIS. They'd hear the radio transmissions, and then they would attack ISIS on behalf of the Taliban, assisting them from the air. No formal, coordination, but the
Yeah.
Taliban knew what channel to be on. So
Yeah, so it gets messy because we're talking about tracking casualties and attacks throughout the war, and this period of time, 2015 to 2019, also coincides with a troop drawdown in Afghanistan, and we saw far fewer U.S. military presence throughout the country, which means fewer targets for the Taliban to attack. So, for instance, I was there in 2010. Every single day, my company alone ran multiple patrols out into this combat area. So we could get hit and shot at 6, 7 times a day, and sometimes we would. Fast forward to 2018, 2019, we had no Americans in that portion of the country at all. So there are just fewer targets. The Talibs down there, they want to get their jihad on, like they have to go somewhere else. They have to maybe come up with a more complex style attack. So it's very hard to say like this actually drove a spike in attacks or it didn't, because attacks against Americans were already declining just due to a decrease in targets. The argument here is that they were incentivized to carry out more risky operations. We saw them try to storm a base in Helmand province. We saw a relative uptick in VBIEDs, so large vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, and a suicide bombing at Bagram Airfield that did kill a couple Americans. But again, we don't know, like, were every one of those paid eventually? Were those carried out because of this bounty program? At what level did the Taliban actually know about this? Right? So if you think about it, they're not issuing this $200,000 to the low-level fighter that's, pushing the detonation switch at Bagram Airfield. Mm-hmm. He's not getting paid, and it's not his family getting paid. It's someone within the Taliban organization higher up. So does that mean that that person shifts their focus on saying, hey, this month we're going to carry out 6 attacks instead of 3? That's the thing that's very hard to we're not going to have an answer on that, to be blunt.
Right.
But I should say the timeline here is also interesting. This company, this front company, GRU front company, ceased operations in 2020, the year that the Doha Accords were signed. All right. Mm-hmm. The next year, 2021, U.S. withdrawal, and then 2022, the front company liquidated. So I'm sure it's just a coincidence. But the timeline kind of lines up with, yeah.
Interesting.
So we'll see.
Do you think you'll see like any U.S. drone strikes in retaliation, or do you think this is over?
Against who?
It is what it is.
They've got people in Russia now, so we're not gonna fly Reapers into Moscow airspace anytime soon. I would imagine maybe some arrest warrants come out, some sanctions against these GRU guys. Some of the Afghans involved in this ring are now living in Moscow. So, they're untouchable in the same degree, I would say. And we don't really have any significant targeting capabilities in Afghanistan right now. We just don't have those assets on the ground to kind of facilitate that degree of strike against this relatively low-level target. So, no, I'd like to see more information come out, but as of now, I wouldn't expect any strong action to follow.
Interesting. So, speaking of people who are not our biggest fans, China, mixed feelings about them here. So, I don't know if you saw this, but you see that China hacked the United States basically entirely.
Okay.
Are you not talking? Oh, wait, you did reply to me, or no?
It said trying to reconnect. I heard you say, speaking of people who are not our biggest fans, China, and it went dark. So,
and then I didn't hear it from you. I was like, oh, maybe he... Okay, anyway, so they have apparently hacked U.S. ports, U.S. power grids, water treatment plants, all kinds of infrastructure, and they have the ability to shut them down at any given time. They're also, as we've talked about, the telecoms hack, they're also in the American telecommunication system. One national security official said that it's so severe they can never be sure that the Chinese are out of the system. And of course, as far as we know, they're still in there. They have no idea how to get them out outside of physically replacing the infrastructure. In addition to that, there's now new information that they breached the Treasury's workstations and that they breached the U.S. government's national security risk database when it comes to investments. So not great. They seem to have entirely hacked the United States. Uh, the U.S. national security infrastructure system, the community, believe that they're doing this in order to kind of cause havoc when the day comes that they invade Taiwan, that hopefully by shutting down the power, contaminating the water, whatever, it will result in the United States having delayed response or just not engaging altogether. It is a bold assumption. Because U.S. nuclear policy changed under the Biden administration, and I don't know, I think this is a Biden change, maybe it came during the Trump administration, is that any cyber attack that results in, blackouts, water contamination, mass havoc, results in a nuclear strike, which experts say this is why you see China building up so many nuclear weapons so fast, is that, well, if you're going to do this, you kind of got to stop them there. I don't know. But it's an interesting little tidbit here. And China says that they're doing this to make America a peace-loving nation, and that if America doesn't like it, then they should stop doing it to China. And I was like, well, that is interesting, because we don't really know much about the United States' cyber activities. We can only assume that we are also doing it. And the only revelation we ever got was in 2022, when the Chinese Foreign Ministry, they had this airing of grievances in Alaska with Secretary Blinken, the U.S. State Department, where they said, look, you're the king of cyber. Anything goes wrong in China, you're behind it. You're always hacking us. You're always messing up our stuff. In the U.S., they denied it and said you're crazy. But that's the only time we've ever heard of U.S. cyber hacking, U.S. cyber attacks going on outside of like Stuxnet, right? So perhaps, maybe the U.S. is doing a lot of cyber attacks in China that kind of alleviate this. I've heard some say that the fact that the U.S. can detect them and knows that this is happening suggests a level of sophistication above China and Russia's. However, I would argue that I think China is perhaps very aware of the cyber attacking going on. It's just a different system. And I don't think you'd ever see China admit that the United States had hacked X, Y, and Z. But I guess that's the nature of autocracy versus democracy, right?
Yeah, I'll disagree with your take of it's kind of I can't remember the term you used, but saying if they cause chaos in the United States, maybe we won't care about something abroad. If they're watching the natural disasters that have played out in the last 12 months, that's my takeaway. I mean, the minute that a hurricane hit East Tennessee and portions of North Carolina, I don't know if you remember this, like Blinken put out a statement that was scheduled to go out talking about financial aid going to Lebanon, and he got dogpiled. Like, it was a different pot of money for a different purpose that had long been scheduled, but it didn't matter. They got hammered over that. Since these wildfires have kicked off, the United States has announced an additional tranche of money going to Ukraine in the form of military equipment, and you've seen this too. People dogpiled. Like, oh my God, we can't take care. It creates a level of any natural disaster, any major issue here in the United States, even if that disaster is brought about by hacking, so it does something with the water supply or brings power down, whatever it might be. I don't know, man. My takeaway is that we very quickly become insular, and anything focused externally, there's a very loud cry saying, why? Let's get this under wraps.
I think I disagree. I think if the power went out and China's behind it, I think it's an attack, right? And I think the American public wants revenge then. I think that's kind of what happens, right?
So the key there would have to be that we would know it was China definitively and make that clear very early. Yeah. Would have to be the thing. In that case, I do think we're talking about a different situation. It'd be hard to predict and less likely that we go down my scenario, but I got you.
Yeah. Now, TikTok, though, a platform near and dear to both of our hearts, looks like it's going to be banned here in 9 days. They say that if the Supreme Court does not stop, does not give us a stay, or does not overturn the Congress's bill, that they are going to shut down the site altogether, take their toys and go home. No sale, nothing. They just will not operate in the United States anymore. It's interesting. President Trump or President-elect Trump. I don't know if we figured out what the correct word is for him yet, given he was president before. But President Trump / President-elect Trump has called on the Supreme Court to not ban it. He says that he is uniquely situated to resolve it and that he can figure it out. The reasoning behind this is that TikTok had quite the charm offensive on him. He's met with the TikTok CEO several times. He keeps showing him graphs about how popular is he on TikTok, and Trump loves to talk about it in press conferences about how popular he is there. They also changed the algorithm to benefit him and amplify him. So he feels some kind of obligation to the app now. He is on there dancing, so I don't know, maybe he is a user. But Kevin O'Leary and the owner of the Los Angeles Dodgers are trying to buy this, and TikTok saying you can try to buy it all you want, it's not for sale. But also, if they take their ball and go home, I think it creates a domino effect around the globe, right? If you see TikTok just give up on its main source of income, if you're the EU, given what's happened in Romania and Croatia with TikTok's interference, I think you're kind of looking at it sideways a little bit. You start looking at it differently, and maybe you start leaning towards banning it because economically, you're going to break the bank here. You could sell this thing for $750 billion, I think. Even more than that. And the fact you're just going to kind of go without it, I don't know, it's got me, I would think, I'd be very skeptical of this. In addition to that, I think, I am agnostic on whether or not it's a mind weapon. I think it certainly hasn't helped things in the United States, but that doesn't mean it's a mind weapon. But overall, what do I think is going to happen today? I mean, the audience will know here. Apparently, they're allegedly going to give their ruling on the 17th. I think TikTok is not going to get to stay. I think there's not a chance the Supreme Court rules against Congress's ability to make a national security law. I think that's going to happen. I think they're going against it. I also think the Supreme Court, in their eyes, they lack credibility. I kind of disagree with their viewpoint of that, right? Where they say they lack credibility. The American people think they're biased one way or the other. And so now Trump calling on them, people are saying, well, then, they have a point to make. They're going to give them the loss here, just to kind of prove that they're independent, kind of try to gain credibility back. We'll see. So that's what's happening there. Any thoughts on TikTok being banned or the whole circus around it?
Yeah. A little backstory there. I don't know, a year ago or something, I've been through a couple bans on TikTok, and I'm mixed on it because the data harvesting isn't as concerning to me just because we have so many apps that mine our data. It's not drastically different. And when you start to see politicians and government leaders and industry leaders using the platform, it makes me think that maybe the risk is overblown to a degree. But I don't know. It's complicated for sure. I have no doubt that China is using this to their ends in some way, shape, or form. They'd be stupid not to. But I went through a couple bans on TikTok, 2 or 3, like back to back to back, about a year ago, I'd say, and ended up chatting with I initiated the conversation, but with some friends that work in and around D.C., they put me in touch with some senators' offices that are interested in banning TikTok. And I presented hey, I talk about national security subjects. Excuse me. I said, I talk about national security subjects, and the account keeps getting banned. And whether you like me or the subject or the platform, irrelevant, it's interesting that these are the subjects that the platform is saying we can't have that, and we're going to remove the account. I had 2 conversations with staffers and then just went silent. I thought that was pretty good ammo if they wanted to use that in one way, shape, or form. Nothing at all there. And then I didn't want anything public for what it's worth. This wasn't the last thing I wanted to do was to be on screen defending or not defending this random platform. But I thought it was interesting nonetheless. And then I did have somebody from TikTok, their public policy team, reach out a few months ago, just to make contact and say hey, let's stay in touch if there's anything, because they put together a ton of lobbying efforts across the platform. And that one also went silent. I hit them up because they said they were doing something at the Army-Navy game. So I was hey, guys, I'd love to be there. Is there anything I can do to help promote the Army Navy game, like that'd be great. And that one went silent. So I feel personally slighted. So now let's ban it. I'm done. If they're not gonna,
I here's what I'll say. I'm appreciative. I got my start on TikTok. I'm appreciative of everything it gave me, but I also recognize that there's something fishy going on here with this platform, in my view. The fact that the Chinese government is lobbying U.S. officials on behalf of TikTok, the fact that ByteDance isn't necessarily allowed to do their full lobbying, and instead it has to be the Chinese ambassador or the diplomats there who are trying to meet with senators and House reps, Trump's team, Biden's team. Something's up here, and I just don't buy. I mean, something's up. I don't know what it is. Maybe they are harvesting data. Maybe they're promoting narratives. I don't think it's like supremely. People say they're doing this to deplete Americans' attention values. I don't know. Short form didn't really exist before TikTok. So, I mean, they would have to do some crazy studies to know that. But
I'll say something that I think about a lot with TikTok and have thought about a lot over the last few years is it is part of an information war in the sense that a lot of people are getting their information there. And we could argue that maybe as Americans, that battlefield is skewed against us and we don't have conditions in our favor in some way, shape, or form, but the people are still there. So I don't know that ceding that space entirely was ever the right move. So when I would get on and see like crazy Russian propaganda or some stuff out of Gaza that was just AI generated and making people think that like the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Rafah, like, okay, I'm going to be on that platform and push back against that. Not against that specific post, but if I'm there, maybe it counters it a little bit. And I understand that's naive. I'm a nobody compared with the overall size of the platform, of course, but there's a little bit of like ceding the battle space that never felt good because the attention is there. Now, if it goes out of the United States and it's purely like a Chinese audience, I'm not going to mess with that, of course, right? Nobody from China's watching me anyways, for the most part. But so long as it has Americans' attention, I feel like we can't completely write something off.
I agree. What do you think about them taking their ball and going home? Do you think it says this is a bioweapon? Because I also had the thought, well, maybe
bioweapon.
Not bioweapon, a mind weapon. But do you think? So my thought was, I was talking to Under the Desk News about this last night, and I said, well, maybe they go. They had a lot of thoughts. They think we're kind of screwed, right?
Screwed as in.
Like the TikTok's getting banned. So I shouldn't say we're getting screwed, but the TikTok creators are screwed. And I'm of the view that I think if I'm TikTok, right now you kind of have no leverage, right? Because the alternative is you get banned in 9 days. Maybe you go dark and then you negotiate a sale from being dark, right? Because you're illustrating that you're just fine, taking no money. Maybe you sell in March or July to an American company. I don't know. There's also a thought that, Trump could have his Department of Justice not enforce this ban. There was talk in Puck about Trump trading China, lowering their tariffs in exchange for selling TikTok to an American company. If that happens, which is apparently floated, I kind of question the whole tariff philosophy. But in addition to that, they're also talking that maybe Trump could convince ByteDance to sell, and I'm just like, I don't know why he could convince them to sell. Other than, I don't know. But that the options seem to exclusively lie here with Trump. If anyone's going to save it, it's going to have to be him. The question is, does he care enough to save it? I don't know. He's 78, 79 years old. He's the same age as my grandpa. My grandpa doesn't care about TikTok. Does Trump care about TikTok? I don't know.
So to shift over to like the creator aspect of this, maybe nerd out for a minute. I feel like TikTok has done a very poor job of having people defend the platform. And the majority of people I know that create content there are like equally frustrated with it as they are happy about it. Imagine the same situation playing out with YouTube. If they said, we're going to ban YouTube, imagine the people that would come out of the woodworks and be like, this has built my business. This has built I have hired employees. We have a team of people that are reliant upon this platform. Entire like major businesses built on the back of that platform. That kind of has happened to a degree with TikTok, not nearly as much. And those people aren't coming out. Maybe I'm missing it, but I'm not seeing it. And for a long time, creators have used TikTok as a way to move into other platforms that are more stable and more rewarding to the creator in a variety of ways, more creator friendly in a lot of ways. So to me right now, it looks like there's just not the support. People go from TikTok to podcasts. They go from TikTok to traditional media. They go from TikTok to YouTube, TikTok to Instagram. Nobody's doing the other one where they're like, I made a killing on this platform and have this huge audience. Let me see if I can make it on TikTok. Just because they don't treat their creators well. The revenue options on TikTok are awful. It's filled with ads, and they just they spam you trying to sell these like cheap Chinese products. You don't see that on other platforms, and I don't know. I don't think they haven't. I don't know how much that plays into what's actually happening here, but I'm not seeing a lot of grassroots pushback. I think those people are like, whatever. If it gets banned, I'm just going to go to IG Reels or YouTube Shorts or whatever Facebook does.
No, I fully agree, and I also think you're right on like the creator aspect. I also think TikTok framed their argument to stay wrong, right? They said it's a First Amendment violation. It's definitely not. Banning TikTok is not a First Amendment violation. Like you said, there are YouTube Shorts, there's Reels, there's X, there's LinkedIn. You can go anywhere, okay? And I think they defended it wrong. I also think creators I think the creator direction, the creator movement took the wrong way as well. Because remember, there was a creator movement to try to unban this thing. I think they took the wrong approach. They kept focusing on China's not a threat, or the app's not a threat. To me, my viewpoint's always been, well, I mean, here's the thing. You're going to get banned, so you need to sell to an American company because this law is not going anywhere. And ultimately, I think being sold to an American company would be better. The payouts are better. Like you said, they don't pay well. They're shady. When we've uploaded now, past 2 days, we've posted 2 videos that together have 7 million views. Over 60 seconds. The CPM we get, as soon as the video, it starts off at like $2. As soon as the video gets successful, it's like 20 cents. They are intentionally doing things to not have to pay creators out. It's just, the whole thing's nonsense. And I won't be sad to see it go. But I guess we'll see everyone on YouTube Shorts then, which pays out better and is better and is not shady. And I think I don't know. Do you use YouTube Shorts?
No, I don't use Shorts as much anymore. But much less censorship I've noticed on YouTube.
Yeah.
There are a problem that I've noticed on TikTok is they'll just take videos down and strike your account, and at times remove your account. Whereas YouTube has a good process of they'll let you run it through checks prior to publishing.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem on TikTok is like I've had the account banned over stuff where it's like, wait, what was the problem there? And I'm not trying to like whistleblow something crazy. Like I just wouldn't have published that piece of content if I knew that it would result in the account being banned. On YouTube, they'll tell you that ahead of time. Like, hey, just so you know, this one's not going to be okay. And you can take that piece out. You can blur something out. You can just not publish. TikTok doesn't do that. And I hate it so much. And they'll go back months to where like, or years even. And they'll randomly grab an old piece of content and say, this is in extreme violation. Your account is now banned. And YouTube's just much better at figuring that out beforehand, in my opinion.
Yeah, YouTube communicates it clearly. TikTok there's no communication there at all.
No.
We don't get banned on either one or any of my accounts. Do I get banned? That's not a thing that happens to us. Step up your game, man. I should try. But yeah, I don't know. Sayonara. Sayonara is all I have to say to it. And I don't know, maybe it'll be bad. I mean, currently Instagram does not pay for Reels, and YouTube, it pays for Shorts, so maybe they'll cut payments because they'll have a monopoly on it. Or maybe it'll create the golden age of American tech again. And maybe Americans won't be so dumb. Maybe that'll fix it. But no, I'm just kidding. I didn't think TikTok created any issues. I think it just preyed on pre-existing issues and made them worse.
All right, and with that, I think it's a good time to hop over to the Middle East.
And part 1, yes.
Yeah, so we're joined by Ahmed, Fouad, Alkhatib. Probably start out with Gaza. Let's get to it.
Yes, and subscribe if you're still watching. All right, bye.
All right, so we're joined now by Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I'm going to read his ex bio because I think that really succinctly just kind of nails what this man's about. Proud American from Gaza City, pro-Palestine, anti-Hamas, and violence, pro-peace. Ahmed, thank you so much for taking the time to chat for a little bit today.
Thanks for having me on. Happy Friday, brother.
Yeah, so you have found this space online, and it's awesome because it shows the nuance of these conflicts, and specifically Gaza, where you've spent a lot of time talking and been a very prominent voice for the last 18 months or so, or at least you've risen to national prominence, maybe I should say, since the October 7th attacks. And it's been interesting to see, from my opinion, you have stayed very firm in your beliefs and your stances, and you have caught some heat from just about every direction, which tends to mean, it tends to be a good thing, but can't be all that comfortable. But I applaud you and thank you for holding your ground.
Thank you, brother. Thanks again for having me. And yes, I have seen folks who started out somewhat on similar ground, but due to either the public pressure to pull in one direction, due to the horror of what's unfolding in Gaza, due to the emotionality associated with just witnessing the horrible consequences of this war, folks shift their attitudes either in a one-dimensional manner or they lose that consistency. And for me, it is difficult. It takes a daily commitment almost to really seeing the big picture. And really, I have lost family members in this war. I carry battle scars from having grown up in there, and I've said this obviously very publicly time and again. And yet, it is precisely that personal price that has prompted me to be consistent and focus on the big picture.
There's a lot of talk. There has been a lot of talk for months about a ceasefire in Gaza, and I feel like early in the war there were a lot more hopes on that mindset, and it's kind of faded to the point now where it almost doesn't make the front page news because we've just heard it too many times that a ceasefire is around the corner and they're negotiating, and here it comes. It does seem like in the last few weeks there's been more talk about that. Where does that sit? Do you think we're at all close to wrapping up at least this phase of what's going on in Gaza?
Well, at the root of the impasse are two parties that are at fundamental odds with each other in terms of what they want as the final outcome. You have Hamas that's using the hostages as its chief negotiating card. It no longer has any military capabilities to threaten Israel, such that Israel has an incentive to pull back and in fact want to do a ceasefire. You have Hamas. The main point for them is that they want a complete end of the war and a withdrawal of Israeli troops, quite frankly, not out of love for the people of Gaza, but so that they can, A, have a role in the day after, and B, ensure the continuity of their governance of Gaza one way or another. Then you have, on the other hand, the Israeli government basically trying to balance out its desperate need to get some hostages out to placate the internal societal pressure. Something like 71% of Israelis support ending the war to retrieve the hostages, living and dead, while at the same time, Israel has made an ironclad strategic decision that under no circumstances, even if it means the lives of Israeli hostages, will it allow Hamas to continue to rule and govern the Gaza Strip. So basically, Hamas wants an end of the war to stay in power and a full withdrawal eventually. And what Hamas shifted is saying, okay, we agree to it in phases, but we want a full withdrawal. Israel is saying, absolutely not. We don't want to commit to an end of the war as long as Hamas has not fully surrendered, even though that term has been nebulous. Like, what does an actual Hamas surrender look like? But Israel has offered, in fact, through back channels, some of whom I've just spoken to, opportunities for Hamas to get out of Gaza and go to Turkey, Qatar, Iran, etc., for what remains of Hamas in Gaza. and this has come up throughout the war in Gaza. Israel has offered opportunities for rehabilitating, and I'm not saying this to absolve Israel of its. Some people will listen to this and be like, "Oh, we told you he's a Zionist sellout. We told you he's absolving Israel." I'm simply saying that Israel too is also desperate for this war to end. Now, what's interesting is the incoming Trump administration and whether or not that will entail some form of additional pressure in the form of either humanitarian aid, deploying special operations forces to assist the Israelis using highly targeted airstrikes on Hamas assets. It is believed that the Americans and the Israelis have some notion of where some of the hostages are, but are afraid of going in out of the concern that they'll be executed. So you have this impasse that we've seen since the beginning of the war, but you could potentially have either a kinetic disruption to it through the Trump administration applying that force, or some kind of a geopolitical disruption by applying pressure on Qatar, by applying pressure on Turkey, or, God forbid, and this concerns me as somebody with family in Gaza, by using the humanitarian aid card as a way to generate societal pressure against Hamas.
Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, you going to go or I'm going?
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
So, in your view, do you think that the hostages are still alive? Like, is this are they just negotiating around corpses at this point, or are there actual hostages still alive that can be negotiated and it's not a front put up by Hamas?
I mean, obviously I'm speculating here, but if I were to go by, I'm looking back at what happened with Gilad Shalit, who was the young Israeli soldier kidnapped in Gaza in 2006. And it is in fact that entire experience in June of 2006 that kind of turned my life upside down, because I was in Egypt trying to go back into the Gaza Strip as a 16-year-old. But when Hamas abducted him, there was a mini war that resulted in prolonged border closures. So, and I want to caveat this by making it absolutely clear that I am not only have been unequivocally against the taking of hostages from the very beginning, and I've been an ally to the hostage families and pushing for their release, but also that I think Hamas is absolutely a criminal enterprise and they are abusing hostages one way or another. That said, I am willing to bet my life that Hamas views the hostages. There are living hostages who are viewed as supremely more valuable than the lives of tens of thousands or even millions of Gazans, because Hamas views them as its way out of the disaster that it started. It views them as a way to end the war and give them a chance to continue governing Gaza. I am willing to bet that while they're not eating lobster and caviar, Hamas is diverting as many resources as it can to keep the hostages as well fed as possible, contextually speaking, within the confines of a deadly war zone with limited options. And so, do I think there are living hostages in Gaza? Absolutely. Do I think they're in the dozens? There probably are. I would be willing to bet that at least of the 96 to 98 who are still in there, at least half of them are in fact alive. And the others who are dead, Hamas, I know it's part of their psychological warfare, but it is also a fact that the Israeli military's own operations have in fact endangered some of the hostages' lives by exposing them to airstrikes, by having them isolated with Hamas, or as we know, infamously a year ago when 3 Israeli hostages were shot at by IDF soldiers. That was a big, big scandal and killed by IDF soldiers. So I feel for the hostages, because not only are they suffering and in dungeons in some cases, and but before I actually finish that thought, so I think after what happened with some of the rescue operations, Hamas moved some of these hostages to actual tunnel complexes. Hamas also now benefits from the sheer population density, because you have to think northern Gaza and southern Gaza, like the northern part of Gaza, has been practically emptied, and most folks have moved to the south. Rafah, by the borders with Egypt, has been also pretty much emptied out. So you're talking about Khan Yunis and Deir el-Balah in the center and south central Gaza that are the core spaces where the population is, with unimaginable density. And so I imagine Hamas is using that to obfuscate some hostages above ground. Otherwise, I'm confident they are in tunnels. So I feel for the hostages, because they're not only suffering and away from their families, they're in dungeons or in inhumane conditions, but they really are the chief negotiating card upon which an existential threat for a terror organization like Hamas can go either through complete annihilation and destruction, or some glimmer of hope for them to continue governing the Gaza Strip.
Do you think it's possible for the elimination of Hamas? And the reason I ask that is, so often we hear that it's an ideology, but Hamas is more than an ideology. It's a political party in a sense. It's an organization, and you can eliminate organizations. You know, it makes me think of Hezbollah. Like Hezbollah could be, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on some updates in Lebanon here in a minute. But you could defeat Hezbollah, and the ideology behind that still stands, and maybe it takes a different form. Is that kind of what Israel's trying to get at, do you think, in Gaza? Like the elimination of Hamas as a functioning entity?
Well, what concerns, I mean, this is what Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke of early on in the war, is the concern that you can replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. I think tactically, Hamas can absolutely be defeated, and has in fact been defeated. I remember vividly over the years and years, I mean, even since the last destructive war in Gaza in 2014, just following Hamas's evolution, seeing them go from basic AK-47s to AKMs or AK-74s, and having them use optics, and having the Nukhba force, and having them have the local production capabilities and the drones and the ability to use saturation rocket attacks to try to evade the Iron Dome as a strategy. So like, I've seen the evolution of Hamas, and I was in Gaza when Hamas was simply a bunch of dudes with AKs and RPG-2s, not even the RPG-7s, RPG-2s that they call that. That's where the Yasin anti-tank rocket RPG came from. So I was very, quite frankly, surprised by how quickly Hamas's first, second, and third lines of defenses folded to the Israeli attack. I was surprised because Hamas made it seem like they actually set up defensive lines. Like they never spoke of the strategy as letting the Israelis come in and then engaging in guerrilla warfare. Their whole strategy was, we have been preparing for a decade to, attack the Israelis head on. And we saw some of that happening early on in the war, where you would see teams of 3 to 7 attack Israelis targets. Then it just went into like 1 or 2 dudes attacking with flip-flops. So I think tactically and operationally, Hamas can be severely weakened to the point of effective defeat. However, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and Jabalia in the north, but Beit Hanun in particular, I mean, to this day, like just a few days ago, the IDF lost 2 soldiers in Beit Hanun, which is literally right on the border with Israel, right next to the Erez crossing, the first point that the Israelis encounter when they send in their tanks. And it begs the question of, is it really possible? I mean, that area has been largely, not entirely, but almost overwhelmingly cleared of civilians. It has been 95% level to the ground, like Mosul-like territory. And yet Hamas is emerging from tunnels. and striking the IDF and striking the. So what is sustaining those attacks? Is it the Is it the Hamas, the ideology, or is it the remnants of Hamas's caches and their tunnels? Is it in fact that Hamas has been able to regroup and is just thinking this is the 1,000-mile journey towards wearing down the Israeli military and making this a costly campaign? So that's more of a, I would say, a tactical military operational question. And then there's the political one, in which well, there's actually another component in which you have the administrative governance one, in which Hamas has maintained its loose grip on power. You see me sharing those videos on YouTube of dudes shooting at supposed looters and supposed opponents of Hamas. You see Hamas is still able to impose taxes on incoming goods and incoming humanitarian aid that gets resold. And so that's a question again of, well, after all this destruction and tens of thousands of deaths and all of this, like, why is Hamas able to continue with that? Is it that, I mean, some on the Israeli side will be like, well, our hands are tied and the Americans are stopping us from going all in to just like wipe them all out. I don't know if that's indeed the case. I think one of the things that's unique about Gaza, though urban warfare is messy and bloody and really difficult, what is, I would argue, exceptional about Gaza, and we have not really seen this in any other urban warfare theater, is that in Mosul, in Fallujah, in Libya, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Syria, in Aleppo, in all of these conflicts that are where you can begin to like draw a parallel and compare and contrast, the population, the civilian population, the non-combatants were given safe passage out of the entirety of the area, such that whoever remained behind, for the most part, was assumed to be affiliated with the militancy. Here in Gaza, what's exceptional is Egypt basically built 3 Berlin walls on its southern border, said absolutely no to Palestinians who wanted to come, except for those, for like around 70,000 who were able to pay that 5,000 or 10,000 bribe before the Rafah border crossing was destroyed. But Egypt said no. I talked to folks in Israel and proposed temporary camps on the Israeli side of the border for like women and children and people, men under the age of 15, all along the border, just to like try to get the population out. But instead, we're in a situation where the population is shifting from one place to another every time the Israelis want to go somewhere. So what does that shift entail? It entails opportunities for Hamas to camouflage its presence. It entails an ability to demonstrate control and dominion over the populace. It entails an option for Hamas to basically hide behind civilians and tie the hands of the IDF in this case. And again, I'm not saying this to be clear, the IDF has struck areas where Hamas is hiding behind civilians and has killed a large number of civilians. So the IDF has absolutely conducted this war in ways that are completely contrary to a lot of the counterinsurgency principles. And don't ask me, ask General David Petraeus, okay, the master of the surge of Iraq in 2007. So you look at the totality of that, and then finally you have Hamas as like a component of post-Gaza war in terms of the ceasefire negotiations. Are they going to be part of the day after? Hamas having some nebulous presence in the West Bank, in Jenin. Hamas abroad in Turkey and or mainly in Qatar. And now there's kind of oscillating between Mauritania and West Africa, Northwest Africa, or Algeria.
Hamas is?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Hamdan. Not exactly as a complete headquarter type, but they're establishing a presence there because Lebanon several times turned down Hamas's the leaders of Hamas and prevented them from coming back to the country after the ceasefire. So you have the totality of the aforementioned, and then you begin to you're talking about a mammoth and a formidable undertaking to talk about eliminating Hamas and reducing that to an objective of a war fought by the Israelis against Gaza, which is what makes it difficult.
Let's talk the day after. So do you see, I mean, you talked about Gaza's role after this is all done, or not Gaza's role, Hamas's role in Gaza after this is all done. Judging by other wars that have ended in, I mean, I imagine, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I imagine eventually Hamas will have to agree to an unconditional surrender, if that's even a thing they can do at this point. Do you see them as having any role, or do you see it going the way of like de-Baathification, like the U.S. did in Iraq, or as the Americans did in Germany and Japan, or do you see them having a much more, or I guess de-Baathification is the opposite of what they did in Germany and Japan. So do you see it going more the post-World War II route in terms of integration of Hamas, or do you see it being more Iraq de-Baathification?
Well, I've argued, I mean, I've written a piece even for the Atlantic Council posing a question of, can remnants of Hamas be essentially recycled? And I actually deliberately used that word, and people laughed at the mere, the more kind of scientific term for it is demobilization, demilitarization, and reintegration, DDR. And DDR as a model has been used in multiple conflicts, particularly ones that are asymmetric in nature. But on the other hand, and so I, as a ruthless pragmatist, as somebody who realizes that Hamas, I mean, a lot of folks who are part of Hamas, there's Hamas the government, there's Hamas the organization, there's Hamas the kind of like the network of social welfare entities that are, part of the way in which the group has fostered dominion over the society. I've argued for reintegrating what remains of Hamas into the day after as a pragmatic necessity to avoid the de-Baathification model, which generated immense resentment, immense anger that ultimately led former Baathists and Iraqi troops to participate in insurgency. Mm-hmm. When you take, especially in a place like Gaza that's really small and isolated, when you take people's ability away to be part of a new government, part of a new future, when you effectively render them perpetual, dispossessed, displaced, disenfranchised citizens who have no economic prospects, even if you don't like a lot of these people, you still have to figure out what to do about them. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, however, what has been immensely disturbing, and part of why, Preston, we opened this up talking about why I've been consistently both heavily critical of the Israeli government, but ruthlessly and ferociously anti-Hamas and all of the cosplayers, and particularly in the Western world, who are in love with Hamas, and the pro-Palestine activists who excuse Hamas. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying all pro-Palestine activists are Hamas, or pro-Hamas. I'm just saying, like, the overt, despicable displays of that is that Hamas's leadership has made it abundantly clear they will fight on to the last Gazan. You can kill 100,000 Gazans, 200, 300,000. They say it over and over that our people are our most precious asset. Not in terms of human capital, but in terms of human sacrifices, which is a very sick and twisted way of saying, basically, time is on our side, and the more of our people that Israel kills, the more Israel is going to be delegitimized, attacked, accused of carrying out a genocide, accused of this and that somehow to Hamas is an insurance policy that ensures their continuity of existence and governance. Those, by the way, are two separate things. Continuity of existence is very much so at risk, because if Hamas loses Gaza, them being reduced to disparate cells and irrelevant cells in the West Bank, and they've just lost Syria, they are basically going to lose Lebanon. They're only going to be operating out of Turkey politically. They can't really do any military affairs beyond some financial businesses and networks. Iran, them being in Iran is irrelevant because they can't really exercise any influence. Like, they're just sitting in Tehran and throughout Iran. So without Gaza, Hamas is forever. It's the beginning of the end for Hamas as an organization, as a relevant party. And keep in mind, the Palestinian National Project and for 76 years, all the different armed resistance organizations, I mean, have come and gone, like the PLO and the PFLP and the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Like, a lot of groups have come and gone, and now there's just like two guys with like a name on the internet. So there is the existential crisis, but Hamas is greedy, and they're not just interested in preserving their existence. They're interested in preserving their governance and their control. And at most, for now, they will agree to some sort of a scenario like what Hezbollah had, where you have these two parallel entities. You had Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'm talking before Hezbollah has been decimated. You had Hezbollah as kind of like a shadow government that could torpedo and do anything, do whatever it wants. But ostensibly, you had the Lebanese government that was impotent, corrupt, incapable of doing anything. So this is the most that Hamas is willing to tolerate in Gaza. And I think for me as a Palestinian, for many of the people in Gaza, the folks that I talked to on the ground, this is completely unacceptable. Like, the sacrifices of the Palestinian people will have gone in vain if after all this loss and all this death and destruction, the same suicidal, maniacal terrorists that led our people to the slaughter continue to exert any influence over our fates. So that's why, in a sense, I view Hamas as throughout this whole conversation, obviously, like, I've not mentioned much about the Israeli government's role, in part because I actually view Hamas, in a sense, as a far deadlier menace, in that it has directly served the far right in Israel and the anti-Palestinian forces and political entities in Israel who seek to displace the Palestinians, who seek to use Hamas as kind of a part of a 3D chess to weaken the Palestinian Authority and to prevent the establishment of a two-state solution. So we need to clean house first before we can even begin to legitimately talk about Israel. For me, there's an imbalance of power dynamics between Israel and the Palestinians, with Israel clearly being an overwhelmingly superior entity that holds all the power politically, militarily, economically, and otherwise. However, even within this imbalance of power dynamics, I think there exists space for Palestinian agency and accountability and self-responsibility to ourselves, to our national project, to our people. So I view Hamas as a deadly menace that is willing to keep going until the very last Gazan child. That is literally what Sinwar said. And by the way, after he was assassinated, I published a piece in Newsweek detailing my conversation with Sinwar when I was trying to build an airport in the Gaza Strip, an internationally run, Israeli-approved airfield in the Gaza Strip. This was years ago. And he would say over and over publicly, we will all burn to hell and every single one of us will die to the last child and we will never surrender and give up. He would say those words, and he would use a fable from the religious text, either in the Quran, but I think it's actually mentioned in the Old Testament. And to describe how we don't care, like Israel can kill us all, but we'll never surrender. So that to me is the scenario. So it's hard to imagine, but whether we're looking at DDR, and that is demobilization, reintegration, which is a superior option, superior to debathification, because debathification assumes you can simply have a bunch of former Hamas guys unemployed, idling by in Gaza, and that they will never pose any security threat to the new government.
Well, let's. That all sounds dark and like it's not heading in the right direction. But let's look up north. There are some positive developments, I think, with Lebanon. They elected a new president, Joseph Aoun, just a couple days ago, and he put out a statement saying, quote, "The era of Hezbollah is over. The terrorist group will be disarmed." How are we feeling about that? Is that at least a step in the right direction? Is there any teeth behind this?
Certainly. And by the way, we're going to end this podcast on a very positive, not manufactured, but we're going to, there's lots and lots of positive in Gaza. So I promise
it is. And these are difficult subjects. So I didn't mean to write that off. It's hard to find the light in some of this, you know?
Short term, it is very grim, believe me, short term, but long term, or not even long term, medium term. I actually, there's a reason why I'm sustained and why I keep going. And if it was all dark and negative, I would have just stayed in California with my former job. But looking at Lebanon, I mean, I think Lebanon, if the beginning of the end of the axis of resistance that is supported by Iran and the IRGC, if that, I mean, that will begin and happen in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And I actually don't see a scenario in which the Israelis pull back from southern Lebanon until and unless Hezbollah either removes its arsenal, retreats beyond the Litani, the army actually comes in, and we saw the United States talking about redirecting some $95 million to the Lebanese army from the package that was designated for Egypt, which I thought was a very interesting, because the Egyptians, in a funny way, they seem to want to have Hamas have a role in Gaza in the day after, and I'm really struggling with that because Egypt has suffered immensely under the Muslim Brotherhood. So anyway, looking at Lebanon, I think the shackles have been broken such that you can criticize Hezbollah in ways that you couldn't before. The Lebanese state can have hope in exercising sovereignty and dominion over its institutions. I think there are opportunities now for the state institutions to begin reclaiming some legitimacy with the population. I remain nervous about, Hezbollah, like Hamas, has been deeply entrenched in every facet of society. And a lot of these Islamist entities and organizations are very resilient, such that even though now Hezbollah is isolated, they've lost their ability to, through the land route that Iran would use through Iraq, Syria, and now into Lebanon, that's gone. Though I believe there probably are some underground facilities that are used for smuggling, but you're not going to be able to bring in some of the heavy rocketry and some of the heavy equipment in those tunnels. You have a situation now where, of course, and the Iranians, were so ridiculous to think that, okay, fine, we're going to try to bring it through the airport, suitcases full of cash or some questionable materials through the Beirut airport. And now the Lebanese state is saying, absolutely not. We will not allow that to happen. You have the Israelis monitoring the coastline, ensuring that, you don't have maritime smuggling to the coast, which the Iranians are actually brilliant at. That's how they got stuff to the Houthis. They got some stuff to Hezbollah that way. They allegedly attempted to get some of that stuff to Hamas, but the Israeli Navy, for years and years, was able to intercept those shipments.
Interesting.
They would actually, they would deploy these barrels, these drums, oil drums, and leave just enough air in them where there is buoyancy, but hope that if you drop it off the coast of Egypt, the draft will bring it up just enough to where it gets caught up in Gaza. And sometimes that would work. Sometimes, most of the times it didn't. Anyway, I think Lebanon is ground zero for the end of the axis of resistance. I think the new Syria, assuming that new Syria does not descend into civil war, there is a honeymoon period right now where people are hopeful, people are trying to engage in a new kind of effort at nation building. There's an effort to, and one of the things is they're trying to prevent, like the Iranians from operating there. Some of the Palestinian groups that were the resistance groups that were supportive of the Assad regime, the new Syrian administration said, absolutely not. You need to either pack up and leave or demilitarize, close your camps, and now you're just strictly a political entity. Because shamefully, some of these groups were actually aiding Assad in his operations against the Syrian people. Then you have, I think one of the things that many people are not willing to talk about is how, and that's what enabled what happened in Syria, is the slight, maybe not as overt shift in Iraq, where even the Shia militias that Iran stood up to fight ISIS and then later on to support the Assad regime, they refused, for the most part, to go into Syria. They said, not our fight. More importantly, the Iraqi government, which was adamant about the withdrawal of U.S. troops out of the nation, now after the Assad regime fell, now said, okay, actually, no, the U.S. troops can stay. And I feel like those two things are not being reported on enough to underscore the shift the desire for a shift in Iraq, because Iran has absolutely subjugated Iraq. Even the Shia in Iraq, many of them, though Iran is their chief patron, if you will, they're very resentful towards Iranian dominion, and they are nationalist Iraqis, and they want to forge an independent regional agenda. And so that in and of itself tells me there is yet another opportunity to destroy the so-called axis of resistance in the form of the official Iraqi state now saying to the Americans, stay, we want your troops, and the Iraqi kind of militia saying, we're not getting involved in Syria. We've shed enough blood. And then finally, I think what the Israelis did in terms of weakening Iran's air defenses, and how the Iranians now, in retaliation for the massive ballistic missile strikes in October, I think the Iranians are exposed right now. That doesn't diminish their threat. That doesn't diminish their capability to wreak havoc in the region. But in a sense, the Israelis have demonstrated that you can actually strike the Iranians, and that Tehran and the Ayatollahs, they're not just going to rain this ring of fire upon U.S. bases, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and the air base in the UAE, and all the regional assets, because the Iranians are also interested in regime survival. So I see the shift, and it is my hope that Mr. Trump, with his intense rhetoric, can actually match that rhetoric with measured policy that induces behavioral change, that induces, and what I worry about is that in an effort to placate those anti-war elements of the right, of MAGA, of the Republican Party, to be clear, I'm very anti-war, okay? But those who are completely anti any U.S. intervention in the Middle East, that could cause the United States to pull back.
Yeah.
In a way that's really harmful to our interests and fails to seize on the shifting sands and the potential to realign the Middle East and reestablish the alliances away from Iran and more towards a U.S.-led alliance, NATO-like alliance that opens up the door for Saudi-Israeli normalization, which is going to be a net positive, I think, for the Palestinian people ultimately, that counters Russia and China's economic and military posture in the region and contains Iran if we're not going to attack them, at least allows the Arabs to be part of a rejuvenated security architecture to contain them.
Well, the possible downfall of the axis of resistance is a positive. I like that. That's a nice way to start to wrap things up. But you did mention we're going to end on a bright note. I want to be respectful of your time here. Which direction were you going to take that?
Well, what I see something radically shifted. I mean, the attitudes of the people in Gaza, people of Gaza who have lived under Hamas's rule and dominion and terrorism, who have experienced firsthand the consequences of this fraudulent armed resistance narrative, who we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the withdrawal of Israeli settlements from Gaza. And I left Gaza 1 month before the withdrawal of settlements in July of 2005. The withdrawal happened in August of 2005. And tens of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of Palestinian lives have been utterly wasted for absolutely nothing, for a fraudulent armed resistance narrative, for Islamist terrorism, for us as Palestinians being part of a regional chessboard that has gotten us nowhere. And the people of Gaza are not stupid, okay? They are afraid, they are struggling, they have been pulled and pushed in many different directions. But there's a disconnect between what Gazans in Gaza are thinking and saying and what folks in the diaspora are saying. And I'm talking not just in Western Europe or in the United States and on college campuses, but even like people in Jordan and people in Egypt and people in Algeria. With all due respect, like, I don't really care what those people have to say. They're irrelevant to me and to what happens. What I care about is what are the people of Gaza thinking? I'm part of a new survey that and publicizing it. I'm going to be publishing it and putting it out. A survey that basically talks about how people in Gaza have turned on Hamas. And it's not the first of its type. It's one coming after a series of similar surveys. People in Gaza were actually opposed to, because Al Jazeera Arabic and Hamas and all this garbage, they don't show the atrocities against Israeli civilians on October 7th. And many people in Gaza are actually, from a values-based point of view, opposed to these atrocities that took place. So I see a shift where people are not just turning on Hamas because of the consequence, but they're kind of able to look back and to really, really see how disturbing it has been to be part of this nefarious regional project that got them absolutely nowhere. Even if Hamas is not immediately defeated, weakened, even if Hamas is somehow involved in the day after, the people of Gaza will never again allow Hamas or someone else to engage in the type of brainwashing and propaganda that they once did. Information travels fast. 2000, when the withdrawal happened, we only had Al Jazeera. There was no ubiquity of the internet. We didn't have social media. We didn't have smartphones. Most citizens in Gaza now see full circle what Hamas has done. And to be clear, they are furious at Israel. They hold Israel wholly responsible for the destruction of Gaza, but they very much so. So, like people in Gaza aren't becoming Zionists overnight. However, they are seeing the picture, and I don't think Hamas or any other mutation of Hamas will ever be able to manipulate the masses in Gaza or hold them hostage in the way that they have for the last 20 years. And that gives me immense hope that within a generation, we will see a radical shift in Gaza away from the armed resistance narrative and more towards nation building, such that Gaza can become the pride and joy of the Palestinian people. It can become a role model of effective Palestinian self-governance, a model for what an occupation-free West Bank can look like, and an opportunity for Palestinians to say enough. We want to preserve our people on what remains of our land. And 76 years since 1948 of all of these failed attempts at armed resistance have completely failed our people. And so I'm hopeful about the attitudinal change that is not, by the way, represented by the discourse on social media. Social media is a microcosm of the mind virus, as Elon Musk said. But the people in Gaza are what give me hope. So that's one. Two is I actually see an opportunity to plug into the regional shifts that I described as part of Gaza's rejuvenation. I don't know what's going to happen in the West Bank. I don't know. I have ideas, I have proposals, I have visions. But I very much so believe in the Gaza first approach to Palestinian nationhood and statehood. I very much so see Gaza evolving to be what it could have been and should have been 20 years ago. And I very much so see Gaza as being kind of like this citadel, not of resistance, but of prosperity, a link between Israel and Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, a regional powerhouse in terms of Palestinian arts and culture. It'll have an airport, it'll have a seaport, and I'm working on a proposal for that, by the way. And all of these different opportunities. So I see out of the ashes something beautiful rising. And again, that's not just big fancy talk to kind of give myself hope. I see the different threads that I'm able to kind of bring together beyond the emotionality and the heartache and break of all that has befallen my people over the past really 2 decades, but over the past 15 months.
I'm gonna be honest, that's a really nice, uplifting point to wrap on.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that take very often. To your point, maybe I'm getting too much information from social media where it's just all, we all hate each other so much. But Ahmed, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Thank you for all that you're doing. We'll put all the links in the description below, but where's a good place for people to follow along with your work?
I think Twitter is a starting point, but I am going to be launching a project under a new initiative under the Atlantic Council. It's going to be called Realign for Palestine. And so that's going to be a project under the Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council here in DC. So be on the lookout for that. But definitely Twitter is a good starting place. I'm on socials, and there'll be a website dedicated for Realign for the Realign for Palestine initiative.
Love that. We'll be sure to check that out. Linked in the description. Head over, check out Ahmed. Thank you again, sir, for taking the time. And for everybody listening, thank you for being here. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see y'all next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so before we actually let you guys go, that was a great interview. Before we let you guys go, Pakistan International Airlines just resumed air travel to the EU after they had restrictions put on them. And the audience and Preston, you guys are going to react to the graphic they posted online together. I will edit it into the video here so people will see what's happening. This is what they posted on their social media. I mean, we had to come back to the show for this. This seems like a threat.
Oh.
And so, if you're only listening to audio, it says it's a plane heading into the Eiffel Tower, and the caption is "Paris, we're coming today." Ooh, oh, not good.
Straight out of the jihadi playbook, right there. Yeah,
And
they might have pulled that from an Al Qaeda publication.
I might have. It is
That.
from. It's still up too.
All right, so which one's worse then? The Pakistan Airlines flying into the Eiffel Tower, or the Buy Me a Coffee promotion the other day that mistakenly showed a North Korean soldier in Kursk looking at their phone?
Ooh,
That one was pretty bad too. Did you see that?
That was bad too. I did see that. I
Yeah,
recognized
they pulled
the photo
it. They
and I
pulled
thought,
it down,
I wonder if they knew.
apologized. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
That's
photo was
crazy.
actually from the accusations that the North Korean soldiers wouldn't stop looking at porn. So it was just like perfect that's the one they went with. But
Oh, absolutely brilliant.
all right,
But do you
Pakistan
think they should
Airlines,
keep
clean
this
it up.
Yeah, do you
No.
think they should keep? I mean, it's still up 13 hours later.
You don't
it's
even
still
have to
up.
read into it. That was 13
No.
hours ago. Oh boy.
Yeah. But anyways, if anyone wants to get a flight into the Eiffel Tower, they're resuming flights between Islamabad and Paris as of today. So use
Thanks for that,
discount code Unclassified to see it. Anyways,
Not a thing.
Did not, maybe. And all right. Well, anyways, like, follow, subscribe, comment, and comment if you would get on this flight. No, I don't know. Just comment if you get here. And thanks, guys.